At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Doadora Airfield, New Guinea. The morning sun glinted off the polished aluminum fuselage, catching the rivets and seams along the twin booms. The air was thick with tropical humidity, the smell of aviation fuel, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid filling McKenna's nostrils. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, the grease and oil already seared into the fabric after 8 months of constant maintenance work. Around him, the airfield buzzed with activity, mechanics checking engines, loading ammunition, fueling aircraft. But McKenna's focus was on one thing: Lieutenant Robert Hayes and the mission he was about to fly. Hayes, 23 years old, a farm kid from Iowa, climbed into the cockpit, adjusting his flight suit and checking instruments with a practiced, methodical hand. 6 combat missions behind him, 0 confirmed kills, and an unspoken fear that this mission might be the one he wouldn't return from. He looked up at McKenna briefly and nodded, a gesture full of trust and quiet desperation. McKenna had seen that look in other pilots' eyes. It was the same look Lieutenant David Chun had worn on July 9th, when he took off for a fighter sweep and returned 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a story of a 0 that had almost killed him. McKenna knew why Chun had survived, just barely. It wasn't skill, it wasn't luck. It was the tiniest fraction of a second, the delay in the P-38's aileron response that gave the Japanese fighter the perfect lead. That delay had killed Chun's friends, Captain William Morrison and Lieutenant Thomas Parker, along with 14 others over the past 6 weeks. Every morning, McKenna had watched pilots climb into their P-38s with confidence, climb into the sky full of hope, and return in pieces, or not at all. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in 6 weeks, most caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape. The P-38 was a powerful aircraft, twin engines, twin booms, fast in a straight line, but it couldn't match the 0 in agility. The lighter, nimbler Japanese fighter could execute a full horizontal turn in half the time it took a P-38. And in the skies over New Guinea, that half-second difference meant death. American doctrine was clear: never turn with a 0. Use speed, use altitude, dive in, shoot, climb out, hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Hayes had tried this doctrine 5 times. 5 missions, all teaching the same brutal lesson. The 0 was smarter, faster, and always ready to exploit the P-38's one fatal weakness. McKenna had heard the official explanation: pilot error. Instructors and manuals insisted the pilots weren't following procedure, but McKenna knew better. It wasn't the pilots. It was the control cables. The P-38's aileron control cables ran through the twin booms to the tail section, and then forward through a series of pulleys to the wing control surfaces. At high speeds, it didn't matter. But during low-speed, tight turns, the kind that decided life or death in the air, there was a fraction of a second delay between moving the stick and the plane actually rolling. The cables had slack. Not much, maybe 3/8 of an inch, but it was enough. McKenna had brought it up to the engineering officer months earlier. The officer had shrugged, saying the slack was within factory specifications, and adjusting it without approval would void the aircraft warranty. Field mechanics had no authorization to modify flight control systems. Lougheed in California controlled that. And yet, McKenna had watched young pilots die because of that tiny slack. He had felt it with his own hands during maintenance. He had listened to the cables, plucked them like strings. Loose cables made a low twang. Tight cables produced a different tone. Every P-38 he worked on was technically in spec, but loose. He knew it. On this morning, Hayes approached him in the maintenance area, asking the question McKenna had feared. "Can you make it roll faster? Anything at all?" Hayes' voice was quiet but urgent. Fear threaded through it. Desperation, too. "I don't care if it's regulation or not," Hayes said. "I just want a chance." McKenna studied the young pilot, saw the same terror in his eyes that he had seen in Chun, Morrison, Parker. This mission could be Hayes' last if nothing changed. McKenna didn't answer right away. He said simply, "Come back in the morning. I'll see what I can do." That night, After the airfield had quieted and most of the crew had gone to sleep, McKenna worked alone. The inspection panel on Hayes' left boom came off with a soft clang. The metal was still warm from the day. Inside, the aileron control cable wound its way through pulleys, taut in some places, slack in others. McKenna pulled the cable with both hands. Felt the slack. Felt the danger. The piano wire came from a salvaged P-38 that had ground looped weeks earlier. He bent it into a Z shape, stiff and stubborn, cutting his thumb twice in the process. Blood on grease made it slippery, but he persisted. The wire would act as an inline tensioner, eliminating the slack and restoring instantaneous response to the controls. Installation was tight, cramped, sweaty work. He held the flashlight in one hand, manipulated the cable with the other, wedged himself into the boom, forced the clevis pin into place, tested the tension. No slack. Perfect. McKenna wiped his hands, replaced the inspection panel, and walked out into the humid night air, heart still pounding. Dawn came. McKenna watched Hayes climb into the cockpit, start the engines, taxi, and take off. Formation flying with 16 other P-38s, heading toward Japanese territory. McKenna stayed on the flight line, silent, knowing that every second mattered, knowing that the tiny modification might save a life, or fail catastrophically. He didn't have to wait long. Hayes' element engaged 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters at 13,000 feet over the Huan Gulf. Dive, roll, fire. Hayes' P-38 responded instantly. No delay, no lag. He rolled hard, reversed direction, pulled lead. And for the first time, the machine did exactly what he commanded the instant he commanded it. 1-0, then 2, then 3 fell in flames in a matter of moments. Hayes didn't chase the fourth, low on fuel. He climbed back to altitude. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Hayes landed, shaken, hands trembling, sweat soaking his flight suit, and walked straight to McKenna. It worked, he said. 2 words. That single modification, a 6-inch piece of piano wire, had changed everything. But McKenna didn't know it yet. Other pilots were watching. Other crew chiefs would soon notice. And the ripple of change that began in a quiet hangar in New Guinea would spread throughout the Pacific Theater, unseen, unapproved, but deadly effective. For now, McKenna stood quietly on the flight line, watching the P-38s land, knowing that sometimes the smallest hands could make the biggest difference in war. And in that moment, he felt something rare: hope. The sun had long disappeared behind the jagged peaks surrounding Doadora Airfield. The air was still, heavy with the scent of gasoline and tropical vegetation, punctuated by the occasional distant drone of an engine from night patrols. Inside the maintenance hangar, Technical Sergeant James McKenna worked alone. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the rows of P-38 Lightnings, their twin booms and sharp noses gleaming in the dim glow. Most of the crew had long gone to bed, leaving McKenna alone with the hum of generators and the soft buzz of mosquitoes skimming across the metal floor. It was the kind of night that demanded focus. Lives depended on it. Every pilot who had walked out to a P-38 over the past 2 months had carried the same unspoken fear. McKenna had seen it in Lieutenant David Chun, Captain William Morrison, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, and countless others. He had signed off their maintenance logs, watched them taxi out, watched them climb into the sky, and in too many cases, he had watched them vanish. The common thread was never skill or bravery. It was the delay, the aileron control cables, the slack. 2 nights ago, Hayes had approached McKenna in the maintenance area. His young face, pale and tense, had carried a determination edged with panic. "Sergeant," he said, voice low, almost trembling, "I need this plane to respond faster. Anything you can do. I don't care if it's against the regulations. I just want a chance. I don't want to die like the others." Hayes' eyes held the weight of everything McKenna had already seen: the empty beds, the letters packed and shipped home, the grief and the rage of mechanics who knew their pilots were dying because the airplane couldn't keep up. McKenna had nodded quietly, masking the internal reckoning. Regulations, engineering approvals, warranties, they all existed for a reason. Yet here, in the Pacific, The reason for those rules had already cost lives. McKenna had thought about it all night. He had tried to sleep, but the ceiling and the rhythmic buzz of mosquitoes were unrelenting. By 2 a.m., he had given up. He needed a solution, and there was only one he could imagine. McKenna crouched on the hangar floor beneath Hayes' assigned P-38. The left boom inspection panel came off with a metallic clang. He ran his hands along the aileron cable, feeling for the telltale slack. 3/8 of an inch. Enough to kill a pilot. Enough to make the difference between rolling inside a zero's turn or becoming a target. His hands, already roughened and stained with grease, moved with methodical precision. He knew what had to be done. From his tool bag, he pulled a small coiled piece of piano wire scavenged from a P-38 that had ground looped 2 weeks earlier. It had been part of a rudder trim system, high-tensile steel, resilient yet flexible. In the dim light, he bent it carefully into a Z shape, knowing this would act as an inline tensioner, removing all slack from the cable without altering the fundamental mechanics of the system. The wire resisted, fighting back against his pliers. Twice his hand slipped, and he cut his thumb. Blood mingled with oil, making the metal slippery. He wiped it against his coverall sleeve and continued. Each bend, each adjustment had to be perfect. Too much tension could overstress the system. Too little would leave the delay intact. The tight space inside the boom made the installation painstaking. One hand held the flashlight, casting moving shadows along the cable's path, while the other guided the wire tensioner into place. His shoulder pressed against the boom structure. The metal edge bit into his arm. Sweat ran down his back, stinging his eyes. Yet McKenna worked with quiet focus. Every second counted. If he made a mistake, Hayes might not survive the morning mission. Worse, McKenna could face court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe prison. Yet inaction was not an option. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, maneuvered the tensioner into position, and reconnected the clevis pin, which took 5 minutes of fumbling in the cramped, dark metal. He pulled on a cable with his hands. No slack. The control surface responded immediately. Perfect. A thrill ran through him. He had done it. Not with permission, not with approval, but with knowledge, skill, and an understanding of the aircraft that no manual or engineer could match. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, and wiped the blood from his hands. The hangar was silent except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional chirp of nocturnal insects. He sat back against a boom and allowed himself a moment to breathe. His heart still raced, and he could feel the weight of the risk he had taken. He had broken every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual, used a non-standard part, altered a flight control system without testing. And yet he had done it for one reason: to give a pilot a chance to live. At 6:30 the next morning, McKenna walked the flight line. The tropical air was already hot and heavy, but there was a sense of anticipation. He watched the crew fuel and arm Hayes' P-38. Engine oil levels were checked, guns loaded, ammunition belts rattling in the trays. McKenna stood quietly, observing, ensuring that nothing would compromise his modification. Hayes approached, flight suit perfectly adjusted, helmet on, straps tight. The young pilot climbed into the cockpit, adjusted instruments, and gave McKenna a brief nod of thanks. No words, no promises, just trust. Taxiing to the runway, Hayes' hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. The engines roared to life, throbbing with pent-up power. McKenna watched as the P-38 accelerated, the wheels leaving the ground at exactly 7:42 a.m., joining formation with 16 other aircraft. The morning sun glinted off the polished metal, catching the rivets and seams along the twin booms. McKenna knew what was coming, and all he could do was wait, heart hammering. Every second stretched into an eternity as he watched the formation disappear into the brightening sky toward Japanese territory. In those quiet moments, McKenna reflected on everything that had led to this point. 17 pilots lost. Good men, some barely older than Hayes, all casualties of a delay too small to be measured, too easily dismissed as pilot error. Chun Morrison, Parker, faces etched into his memory. Letters sent home, beds left empty, Planes returned riddled with bullet holes or never returned at all. And now Hayes, carrying the lives of his friends in his hands, relying on a single modification, a 6-inch piece of wire, and the skill of a mechanic who had refused to wait for approval. The hangar smelled of oil, metal, and anticipation. Outside, the airfield hummed with life, but inside, everything was silent except for the rhythm of McKenna's heartbeat. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the fragile line between life and death in the sky. The fate of the mission, of Hayes, of countless others, rested on a single decision, a single act of ingenuity in the quiet of a tropical night. And in that moment, McKenna understood something profound. Sometimes, in war, the people who matter most are not the ones in the cockpit or in command offices. Sometimes they are the quiet, unsung mechanics who see the problem, who act without permission, who shoulder the responsibility of life and death and do not falter. The morning mission had not yet begun. The sky waited. The Japanese fighters waited. And somewhere high above, at 8:14 a.m., the sun was climbing over the jagged New Guinea coastline, scattering long shadows across the dense jungle below. Lieutenant Robert Hayes' P-38 Lightning sliced through the sky in tight formation with 3 other aircraft. The engines roared, a twin-engine symphony of power and promise, each note vibrating through the airframe and into Hayes' bones. The Pacific horizon stretched endlessly before him, a shimmering, blue expanse hiding the deadly enemy waiting above. His element leader's voice crackled over the radio. Bounce. Eyes on the enemy. Stay sharp. Ahead, 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s hovered, waiting for their prey, a swarm of sleek, agile death. The Japanese pilots had been hunting American aircraft, like Hayes' P-38s for months. They knew the P-38's weakness intimately. It could not match the Zero in a tight turn. All they had to do was bait him, force him into a maneuver he couldn't escape, and the kill was theirs. Hayes tightened his grip on the control stick, palms slick with sweat despite the early hour. He had faced these Zeros before. He had lost friends to them. David Chun, William Morrison, Thomas Parker. Their faces were etched into his mind. And now, flying the modified P-38, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. Something was different. He didn't know what McKenna had done, but the plane felt alive, responsive, ready. The first Zero came into view, trailing a glint of sun on its fuselage. Hayes dove from altitude, engine screaming, building speed to 380 miles per hour. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. His finger tightened on the trigger. For .50 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon roared to life, tracers spitting streaks of fire through the morning sky. Bullets ripped past the Zero's fuselage. Sparks erupted off its wing. But it wasn't enough. The Zero snap-rolled to the right, dove into the clouds, and Hayes followed instinctively. That's when he felt it. The P-38 responded instantly. No delay, no lag. The stick moved, the plane moved. The controls obeyed his command with perfect precision. It was like flying a different aircraft, one designed to anticipate his thoughts. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time, pulled the nose down. The Zero was in sight. Another burst. 3 seconds of controlled fury, and the Zero's engine exploded. Flames, debris, smoke trailing into the sky. One kill. Before Hayes could breathe, another 2 Zeros came diving in from above, seeking revenge. The first strafing run left one behind him, trying to scissor, trying to reverse direction to get inside his turning radius. Hayes rolled hard left, pulled up, reversed the maneuver, instantaneous response, perfect precision. He felt the difference immediately. The Zero hadn't expected such speed, hadn't anticipated the counter. Its nose swung past him as he fired again. Wing folded. Second kill. The third Zero was clever, but not clever enough. He tried the same maneuvers that had killed so many American pilots, but Hayes' P-38 moved like it weighed half as much. Each reversal, each roll, each climb and dive felt fluid, precise. No fighting the controls. No lag. Inside 200 feet, Hayes fired short bursts. The Zero's fuselage exploded, spinning violently toward the jungle below. Third kill. The fourth Zero fled, bleeding altitude, and Hayes let it go. Fuel was running low, ammunition thinning, and the fight had lasted only 7 minutes, but every second had been life or death. His hands were shaking, chest heaving, sweat soaking his flight suit. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with what remained of his flight, and headed for home. The roar of the engines felt like victory and relief all at once. Landing at Doadora, Hayes taxied to a stop. McKenna was there, waiting on the flight line. Engines shut down. Cockpit canopy opened. Hayes climbed out, knees weak, hands trembling. He didn't waste words. 2 simple ones. It worked. McKenna nodded quietly, absorbing the relief in Hayes' voice. The morning's engagement had proven what he had suspected all along. The slack in the aileron cable had been the difference. A 6-inch piece of piano wire, bent into a Z shape, had restored the P-38's instantaneous response, allowing Hayes to roll, climb, dive, and reverse faster than any Japanese pilot could anticipate. Lives had been saved. Death had been cheated. But the change didn't end with Hayes. Captain Frank Mitchell, flying 15,000 feet above the engagement, had observed the fight in awe. He knew every pilot in the theater, knew their skill levels, knew how long a P-38 took to roll, to recover from a dive, to reverse direction. But Hayes' aircraft moved like it was alive, instantaneous, perfect. Mitchell had never seen a Lightning perform that way. After debriefing, Mitchell tracked McKenna down. The grease-stained, blackened mechanic was hunched over another P-38, lost in work. Mitchell asked bluntly, "What did you do to Hayes' airplane?" McKenna looked up, expression calm but wary. He explained, the piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized change to the flight control system. Mitchell listened, absorbing every word. Then he asked quietly, "Can you do it for mine?" McKenna hesitated, thinking of regulations, court-martials, discharges. Then he nodded. "Yes, but you need to understand the risks." Mitchell didn't care. He had lost 4 pilots in his flight over the past month. If this modification gave them a chance, it was worth any risk. That evening, McKenna installed the same tensioner in Mitchell's P-38. Same method, same precision. The work was quiet, secretive, but meticulous. The effect was immediate. Mitchell flew the next morning, returning with a grin of disbelief. "It's like flying a fighter instead of a truck," he told his wingman. Other pilots overheard. Whispers spread through the hangar and ready room. Some crew chiefs refused to attempt such modifications, citing regulations. Others, desperate to save lives, quietly asked McKenna for guidance. One by one, more P-38s received the tensioner, and slowly, the balance of power began to shift. In the sky over New Guinea, the enemy had not yet noticed. Japanese pilots still executed the tactics that had killed dozens of Americans. They forced tight turns, tried to bait, tried to anticipate the P-38's sluggish response. But now, there was no delay. The Zeros misjudged every maneuver. Pilots, who had once been confident, now hesitant, began to die. The smallest modification, a 6-inch piece of piano wire, was changing the air war in the Pacific, one engagement at a time. For Hayes, for McKenna, for every mechanic and pilot who witnessed the change, the stakes had never been higher. Lives were saved, enemies fell, and history shifted, quietly, invisibly, in the hands of a single mechanic who refused to wait for permission. By August 20th, the change was no longer confined to Hayes and Mitchell. Word had traveled quietly through the squadron, carried in whispered conversations in the ready room, passed from pilot to wingman, mechanic to crew chief. No official documentation. No engineering approval. No higher command knew. Yet the effect was undeniable. Planes rolled faster, reversed quicker, responded instantly. The Pacific skies over New Guinea had begun to shift in ways that no one could officially explain. James McKenna, grease-stained and exhausted, moved from aircraft to aircraft on the flight line, installing the tensioners in secret. Each modification took 8 minutes, meticulous work in tight spaces beneath the booms of the P-38. Sweat ran down his back, hands raw from pulling and bending the high-tensile piano wire. Every connection, every clevis pin had to be perfect. A single error, and a plane could spin out in combat. He could feel the weight of the lives depending on his work, the unspoken trust placed in him by every pilot who climbed into the cockpit. Meanwhile, pilots were returning from missions, some with kills, some with stories they had never been able to tell before. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at Gussap, had heard of the modification from a pilot who had transferred from Doadura. Skeptical, Watkins installed the tensioner in a single P-38. The next morning, the pilot returned with his first kill after 8 weeks of combat without success. Watkins modified for more aircraft. Other crew chiefs followed suit. Within a week, perhaps 40 P-38s in New Guinea carried the same silent modification. The impact on morale was immediate. Pilots who had lost faith in their aircraft began to feel hope again. The dread that had settled over the squadron like a fog, born from repeated losses and the knowledge that their planes were slow to respond, lifted slightly. They felt in their hands what McKenna had known all along. This was not a failure of skill, not a bravery. It was the aircraft, and now the aircraft could fight back. Japanese intelligence, on the other hand, began to take note. Experienced Zero's pilots started reporting unusual encounters in late August. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet noted that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster, reversing directions more quickly. Tactics that had been reliable for months suddenly failed. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, faced this firsthand. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Waiwak. He executed his standard tactic: draw the American into a turning fight, snap the aircraft to reverse, and get inside the P-38's turning radius. Dozens of times before, it had worked perfectly. But this time, the P-38 responded faster than it should have. Sakai narrowly avoided a head-on collision, pulling up to dive away while the American gained guns on him. Sakai returned to base confused, frustrated. His tactics had failed, and he had no explanation. Other Japanese pilots reported similar experiences. The Americans weren't flying differently. Their planes weren't upgraded in ways that were visible. Engines were the same, weapons the same, airframes identical. Yet somehow they rolled faster, reversed more efficiently, and responded immediately. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't fight what they couldn't see or comprehend. The ripple effect spread through the American squadrons as well. Pilots who had flown for weeks without a single victory suddenly found themselves with kills. Captain Frank Mitchell, now flying with the tensioner installed, returned from a mission with 3 confirmed kills. The first of his career he had taken in weeks, without losses, to Japanese aircraft in his element. Hayes, fresh from his first 3 kills, scored 2 more on August 22nd. By late August, the squadron was a force to be reckoned with. McKenna continued to work quietly, unnoticed by higher command. He was meticulous, careful. Each installation was done without leaving evidence for inspectors. Crew chiefs learned to remove the tensioners before inspections, reinstalling them afterward. The engineering officer at Doadura noticed something unusual in cable tension readings, but could not trace it directly to McKenna's work. The modification remained secret, a whisper among men who understood the stakes. As the weeks passed, the kill ratios began to shift. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific had lost 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed. By August, the ratio improved to 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. The modification was changing the course of engagements without anyone officially knowing why. Morale soared. Pilots flew with renewed confidence. Mechanics felt pride in the aircraft they prepared, and a subtle, unspoken trust developed between crews and airmen. The war in the air was still brutal, still dangerous, but now there was hope. Lives were being saved. Friends were coming home. The dread of the Pacific sky began to waver in the face of precision, skill, and ingenuity. And yet, the danger was far from over. Every engagement carried risk. Fuel ran low, ammo depleted, and Japanese pilots adapted, even if slowly. The modification had not removed the danger. It had only leveled the playing field, giving Americans a fighting chance where before there had been little. Every mission was a gamble, but now one they could win. McKenna never sought credit. The world would not know his name, not yet. For him, the satisfaction came quietly, in seeing pilots return safely, in hearing their stories, and knowing that the hours spent bending piano wire in the cramped, dark boom of a P-38 had changed the tide of battle in the Pacific. By mid-September, the Japanese pilots, facing inexplicable losses, were forced to adapt. Orders came down from the 11th Air Fleet. Avoid engaging P-38s unless a significant numerical advantage existed. The hunter had become wary. The confidence of 2 years' supremacy was shaken. What had once been their advantage, the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, was now neutralized, unseen, and invisible, hidden within the mechanical ingenuity of a single sergeant and a piece of piano wire. The skies over New Guinea would never be the same. The war in the Pacific continued to rage, but for the pilots and mechanics of the 5th Air Force, a subtle revolution had begun. American P-38 Lightnings, once hampered by delayed aileron response, now rolled, reversed, and maneuvered with precision that caught even seasoned Japanese pilots off guard. Lives were saved, kills increased, and a small piece of ingenuity, a 6-inch piano wire bent into a Z, had shifted the air war's balance without any fanfare, awards, or recognition. Lieutenant Robert Hayes continued flying with the modified P-38, now confident and lethal. He completed more missions, each engagement sharpening his instincts, each kill reinforcing the invisible advantage McKenna had provided. On August 22nd, he shot down 2 more Zeros during a morning patrol. By late August, Hayes had claimed 5 victories in less than 10 days, a remarkable turn for a pilot who had returned from prior missions empty-handed, frustrated, and terrified. Captain Frank Mitchell, inspired by Hayes' success, began flying aggressively, testing the limits of his newly responsive aircraft. He returned from missions with multiple kills, reporting to his squadron that the plane handled like a fighter, not a truck. The other pilots noticed. Crew chiefs who had installed tensioners began seeing tangible results. Planes that once lagged during tight maneuvers were now instantaneous, responsive, and deadly. Word spread quietly. Pilots asked their mechanics if they'd heard about the modification, often met with a wink and a nod, a shared secret that ignored regulations but saved lives. The effect on Japanese pilots was profound. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most skilled aces, faced a P-38 that rolled faster than he had ever encountered. Tactics that had reliably trapped American pilots now failed. Pilots who had once attacked with confidence hesitated, their timing disrupted by planes that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet noted a disturbing trend. P-38s were now maneuvering aggressively, reversing directions instantly, and surviving encounters that should have been fatal. By mid-September 1943, statistics confirmed what mechanics and pilots had already seen. Japanese losses were increasing, American losses decreasing. For the first time, P-38s were killing Zeros at better than a 1-to-1 ratio. The once feared hunter, the Zero, was being outmaneuvered, outgunned, and forced to retreat unless overwhelming numbers were used. The secret of the piano wire tensioner remained unknown to the enemy. It wasn't in manuals, it wasn't documented in official records, and it certainly wasn't public knowledge. It existed quietly, inside the booms of modified P-38s, invisible but lethal. And yet, the credit for this quiet revolution never reached the man who had made it possible. James McKenna remained at Dowadora, grease-stained and unnoticed, a sergeant among dozens, quietly modifying aircraft in the dark, risking court-martial, disobedience charges, and dishonorable discharge. He never sought recognition. To him, the thrill was in the pilots returning safely. Hayes landing after a successful mission, Mitchell reporting the plane's exceptional handling, crew chiefs seeing kills for the first time in weeks. All of that mattered more than medals or commendations. McKenna completed his work in New Guinea and remained in the Army Air Force until 1946. After the war, he returned to California, settled in Long Beach, and returned to what he knew best, working on engines, first for others, then for himself. He opened his own garage in 1948 and worked there for decades. He never talked much about the war. If asked, he would say simply, "I was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes. That's it." The story of the piano wire tensioner, the modification that had changed the outcome of countless dogfights, went untold. Lieutenant Hayes survived the war. By 1945, he had flown 63 combat missions, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, and returned to Iowa. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and lived a quiet life as a crop duster for 37 years. Each year, on the anniversary of August 17th, he would call McKenna to thank him, reminding the old mechanic that he was alive because of his ingenuity. Hayes never forgot. He knew that without that small act, bending a piece of piano wire in the cramped confines of a P-38 boom, he might have joined the growing list of young men lost to the Zero. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived, rising to squadron commander during the Philippines campaign, shooting down 16 enemy aircraft. He shared the story of McKenna's modification with every young maintenance officer under his command, teaching them an important lesson. Sometimes the best solutions come from those who see problems firsthand, who refuse to wait for permission when lives are at stake. Mitchell ensured that the lesson of McKenna's ingenuity was passed on, even if the man himself remained in the shadows. It wasn't until 1991 that McKenna's work came to light. A military historian researching P-38 modifications discovered references to the piano wire tensioner in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. At 73, still working part-time in his Long Beach garage, McKenna confirmed the story. He downplayed its significance. "It wasn't anything special," he said, "just something that needed doing." Yet the historian estimated that McKenna's modification may have saved between 80 and 100 pilots based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that had used it. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park, California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic, but made no note of the piano wire tensioner. No mention of how he had changed the way American fighters flew. No acknowledgement of the regulations he had risked breaking to save lives. His legacy existed quietly, in the men who survived because of him, in the lives he saved, and in the gratitude of pilots like Hayes and Mitchell. The Long Beach garage still stands, a testament to a life of work, skill, and quiet heroism. On the wall of the back office hangs a faded photograph, a young mechanic in coveralls standing beside a P-38 Lightning, the date on the back reading August 1943, New Guinea. A simple image, a single man, and a machine that became something more through ingenuity, courage, and determination. This was how innovation happens in war, not through official channels or committees, but through the hands of those who see the problem, find the solution, and refuse to wait for permission. James McKenna's story is a reminder that heroism is not always loud, not always celebrated, but sometimes quietly bending a piece of piano wire can change the course of history, save lives, and alter the balance of power in the deadliest skies on Earth. And for those who returned home, Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and countless others, every mission flown, every enemy plane downed, every life saved carried the invisible mark of the mechanic who refused to wait, who acted when it mattered most. The Pacific skies would never be the same, and neither would the legacy of the men who worked in silence, grease-stained and unsung, changing the fate of war one small, perfect adjustment at a time.